And then the disaster struck in the early 13th century. The Mongol invasion, which will change forever the whole makeup of the future Russian society. Because interestingly enough, until the Mongols, these numerous cities of the so-called KIEVAN RUS and their princes, they were more interested in trade than they were interested in agriculture. And needless to say, very large estates were being established, but the princes were more interested in trade because, well, they were the Rurikovichi, or the Rurikoviches, who were the heirs of these pirates, merchants, the Norsemen. And they conducted a great deal of trade with Constantinople and, in fact, later on with Islamic states. And their income was derived from that far more than from agriculture. And then the men who supported the princes, whose name ultimately will be the boyars, the future aristocracy, they too at first were in fact paid by the princes either in kind or with gorgeous vessels, or with often with Khazar coin or Islamic coin, or Byzantine coin. And agriculture was not as important to these cities. Also, in the cities themselves, they, even though a prince technically ruled the city, but the cities were also ruled by a popular assembly. Many of the cities were ruled by popular assembly, and the popular assembly was quite powerful. When one thinks of Novgorod and Pskov, that was all popular assembly, which the princes were not in love with, to say the least, because the popular assembly had its own voice, which voice could not be contradicted by the princes. So interestingly enough, it was ultimately the same development as was happening in the West in the 12th, 13th centuries, where the cities ultimately entirely asserted themselves. And that's when Western democracy, in fact, began to be born. In Russia, the opposite happened. Those couple of very short centuries, the 10th, the 11th, well, the 12th centuries, when these cities were being established and the popular assembly was becoming more and more powerful, all of that ended with the Mongol invasion. In fact, ultimately, the elite of the Mongols and the Russian princes and the boyars were in cahoots at stamping out the popular assembly altogether. So even though there was this original democracy that slowly appeared in Russia, pretty much the moment it appeared, it disappeared shortly afterwards because of the Mongol invasions. I mean, we don't know what would happen otherwise. The princes were opposed to these popular assemblies, but then the Western princes were opposed to them as well, but then the best thing they could do ultimately was to join them, whereas in Russia the opposite happened. Mongolia is right there with Karakum, where they all started, and then on a straight line they proceeded to Beijing. They will ultimately conquer all of China, all of Central Asia. The exception will be India, Burma, but otherwise they swept through the world right here. Now, the Mongol people, pretty much, it seems that they numbered about 1 million altogether. The people they conquered, about 100 million. So there was something very powerful taking place among the Mongols. And when they conquered these people, they in fact also conscripted them into their own armies. And it often happened that while the invading force was of a certain numbers, the force that went invading further was larger. They ultimately will divide into the 4 major Khanats. Well, the greatest of the Khanats is the Khanate of the Great Khan, right here. and that Khanate will include all of Mongolia and Korea and all of China. Then there will be the Chagatai Khanate, right here, that will include Samarkand, Kashdar, here. Still another one, the Persian Khanate. And then finally the Golden Horde, the Khanate of the Golden Horde. And that Khanate will settle itself, the center of it will be in the city of Sarai on the Volga River. And then all the principalities will be paying it dues. But this is the Mongols. The Mongols, at most, they had fewer than 150 troops. So their secret was in their incredible velocity. They were they had an extremely swift combination of light and heavy cavalry. The light cavalry was just armed with bow and arrow, and the heavy cavalry was armed with saber, lance, battle axe or mace, and the lasso. They had a helmet of leather, later iron, and a leather cuirass or a coat of mail. They had an incredibly speedy communication because of their very mobile ponies, or they communicated by smoke, but they knew within a day what was happening everywhere else. It was really astonishing, the speed with which they operated. And here they are. Here's the light cavalry, right here with bow and arrow, and here are the heavy cavalry that stand behind, and they are fully mailed and with lances. And these are the four Canets again. Here is the Great Khan, and the Chagatai, the Golden Horde, and the Persian Khanate. So they had taken all these lands. This is very educational, just a comparison. This is the Roman Empire at its height in about the year 120 AD, and this is the Mongol Empire more than 1,000 years later. Here's the Mongols, the blue, and here is the Roman Empire in red. Now, while for the Russians, the Mongolian invasion was, needless to say, a tremendous occurrence, which changed forever the future course of this very young and frankly uncertain nation. For the Mongols, it was just another invasion, if you really look at it from the point of view of the Mongols. And in fact, the least interesting invasion, because they have overrun China with its remarkable, very ancient history. They have overrun Persia also with its incredibly remarkable history. And even part of Russia right here, which was part of Persia, was also extremely interesting. This part of the Golden Horde. They could learn from all these lands that they overran. They could learn culturally, and they were anxious to learn. So all these lands were very ancient lands. They could learn absolutely nothing from Russia. So as a result, Russia for them was essentially just a source of income and slaves. And that's how they treated it. They treated it with absolutely, with no respect, as a milk cow. That's what Russia became to the Mongols. So here is the Golden Horde in Russia. They in fact overran all the green part as well. It's just that later, at first, the Mongolians themselves were tax collectors, but then the Russian princes, when they realized where the power was, and the power at this point concentrated here on the Volga River in the city of Sarai, Old Sarai, New Sarai. This is where power concentrated, and this is the power that determined which Russian prince, in fact, was invested with his rule and which did not. Before a Russian prince was invested, he had to travel to Sarai right here in order to be invested. And for that purpose, they had to pay an enormous amount of dues. And in many cases, they had to travel further. From Sarai, they had to travel, in fact, to Beijing, right here, or Peking, in order to be confirmed by the Great Khan. And this was a regular occurrence. So their power depended on the city of Sarai, and as a result it was the city of Sarai that became the center of intrigue and the center of backstabbing. Before long, the Mongols no longer needed to send their own tax collectors, because the princes did it for them. The princes and then the boyars. They were very willing servants of Sarai, and in fact they vied with each other for greater treasure. And because the Mongols pretty much stopped all trade routes, they cut them off from the Russians. The Russians, the only outlet now became the land, and that's when the land began to be developed. And all of that fell upon the shoulders of the peasantry. And the prince who could squeeze the most out of the land was then approved by Sarai, by the city of Sarai. Here is the Golden Horde, as I said, with the city of Sarai right here. And here is the city right there. So the Mongols later just retreated. Pretty much, they didn't have to do anything. The Russians did all the work for them. They were not interested in Russian culture because there was not much, and the Russian princes and boyars collected their dues and their taxes for them. Novgorod and Pskov were fortunately removed from that. Moscow really began to develop once the KIEVAN principality, once they began to fight with one another and needed to escape one another, they began to travel northeast, which is, here's Kiev, this is northeast, and that's where they traveled, and that's when these towns came to existence. But Novgorod and Pskov were kind of outside of the Mongol influence, which is interesting in itself. Vasily Vereshchagin, who is another brilliant artist, Russian artist of the 19th century, painted this harrowing canvas at the end of the 19th century. Now, he painted it, he called it the Apotheosis of War, and he painted it as an emblem of all wars and what happens as a result of all wars. But when Russians look at it, they think of the Mongol invasion, which left corpses, millions of corpses in its wake, and ruined towns. And truly enough, the Mongols at first came to Russia, and that was in the early 13th century, right here, the Battle of the Kalka River on May 31st in 1223. When the Mongols, this is how they traveled, right here. They first came upon the so-called Cumans, which was also a Central Asian tribe that settled in the area. And by this time, the Cumans and the Russians were connected by marriage, and they were connected by trading ties. So the Mongols, they came upon the Cumans, and then the battle ensued of the Cuman and the Russian forces. And that was the battle right here of the river Kalka, right above the Azov Sea, which is today is in the Ukraine. Speaking of Vereshchagin's painting, the Mongols are reported to have celebrated their victory with an enormous feast that was held above a wooden floor under which they placed their Russian and Cuman captives, the ones they couldn't use as slaves. And while the feast was going on, the captives were slowly crushed to death. The Mongol general who conducted this first invasion was one Subudei, but then he left. No one could understand, the Russians themselves couldn't understand. But he did. He and his troops disappeared for about a decade and a half. And when the Mongols came back closer to the middle of the 13th century, they were now led by Batu Khan, and he was a relative of the original Genghis Khan. Subudei was now his chief of staff, so obviously he was the one who knew the lay of the land. Suzdal was sacked by Batu Khan in February of 1238, and Kiev was in November 1240. And here is Suzdal, as you see here, and there's Kiev. So they first attacked Suzdal here, then Kiev. Moscow wasn't there, there was not much to attack. As they attacked, they either enslaved the population or they killed the population, one or the other. In fact, in Kiev there were sort of two invasions. One was in November and the other in December of 1240. And between the two invasions, the Kievans built an extra wall, wooden wall, inside the first wall. And but when the Mongols came the second time, they hid behind those walls. And what we see here are people actually crushed underneath the walls. Also, many hid in churches, and these churches were burned together with the people inside the churches. So these invasions were harrowing. They were horrific invasions, there's no question about it. But once they settled, the Golden Horde, as I said, became master of all, and the Russian princes went to Sarai to bow, to pay dues, and to be named, to be given their lands. These are the crafts that I had mentioned that were developed in Russia by that time, by the time of Mongolian invasions. What the Mongols did, they did not only take a great deal of slaves, they also conscripted Russians into their army. There was an elite troop of the Russians in Peking serving the Great Khan. But they also were very eager to take the craftsmen, and hundreds of very skilled craftsmen were shipped all the way, not only to Sarai, but also all the way to Peking to work there. And essentially that too contributed to dissolving of the importance of cities, and also of depleting Russia of whatever craftsmen they had at the time. And some of the crafts just disappeared altogether until considerably later. And now these are later examples, and presumably the early examples were even superior to these. Some of the crafts included enameling, and enameling could be done either in Champlivet or cloisonné. Now cloisonné, this egg is done in cloisonné in the 19th century by a factory of Khlebnikov, and they were great makers of cloisonné. It's a very ancient type of skill. A border is soldered to a surface, a border of silver, a border of gold, and then in between the borders, molten glass is poured in, and that's how cloisonné is made. On the other hand, Champlivet, it means raised field in French. What they did then here, the surface itself would be depressed, the ornamental surface would be depressed, and then the molten glass would be poured into that depression, but would be slightly raised, and that's why it's called Champlivet. So this is a goblet, this is an egg, and it seems that both these crafts were very advanced, in fact, in Russia towards the year 1200, but they disappeared. Here's another example of cloisonné that was made circa 1900. It's a very large kovsh, which is just a kovsh is an elaborate ladle, and sometimes they're less elaborate, sometimes they're just wooden. But that's what was used by the Russians for a ladle. And this one is quite large. This is 9 inches in length and about 6 inches in height, and it weighs half a kilo. And so that's cloisonné. Another type of skill that also seems to have reached its zenith is a filigree. A filigree, it's traditional metalworking that marries sterling silver with spun fine silver filigree, meticulously shaped, and the tension in the shapes is established before it is soldered into place, and it just seems to be bursting out, and because the spun threads of silver are so fine, it's really remarkable. And still another craft that existed before the Mongol invasion is the so-called niello. Niello is a black mixture, usually of sulfur, copper, silver, and lead, and it's used as an inlay on engraved or etched metal, especially silver. So here is a collar, a Russian collar, and here is the close-up, so you can see it better. So these crafts just disappeared. And needless to say, by this time, the Byzantines had taught Russians the building techniques, the carpentry techniques, the various skills. All the craftsmen, or the majority of the craftsmen, all the better ones, were taken as slaves by the Mongols to their own territories, leaving next to nothing for the cities, and then the cities were destroyed. So it will take centuries for these cities to come back. This is an example of one of the rulers, actually, who was very formative in establishing the Moscow state, and his name is Ivan Kalita. Kalita means a money bag, and he lived in the early part of the 14th century. He was more successful than all other princes from all other towns in collecting dues from his own people and whoever was under his influence. And this comes from a manuscript, Life of Saint Sergius, a 16th century manuscript that shows Ivan Kalita as he is dispensing justice to the boyars here and there, and here they're being beaten, here beaten again, and working for Kalita in collecting the dues in kind, all sorts of dues, and he was most successful. And that's how Moscow, in fact, came into prominence. He was the chief revenue agent for the Tatar Khan, and hence his name. So he was the chief revenue agent, the chief tax collector, and the chief spy to the Khan, and that's what made actually Moscow so successful at first, and then it just grew from there. A man who lived a century earlier and who is known to the Russians and to the West as Alexander Nevsky because of the film, the 1938 film that was directed by Sergei Eisenstein, and it is called Alexander Nevsky, and Alexander Nevsky will later become a saint. It depicts, the film itself depicts the great battle on ice on the river Neva, which is where Alexander got his sobriquet Nevsky, from the battle on the river Neva on ice in the 13th century, was between the Teutonic Knights and of the Holy Roman Empire and the Russian forces. And Alexander Nevsky was victorious. Well, the year is 1938. The Germans, Hitler is in power, and even though Stalin and Hitler conclude the peace treaty, This film was, in a way, a propaganda film to show the Russians how much more valiant they are than the Germans. This same Alexander Nevsky also denounced his own brother Andrew to the Khan for having been remiss in his duty to the Golden Horde. And in fact, it was the Golden Horde that installed our Prince Alexander as the Grand Duke of Vladimir after ousting his brother. So these men were very, very much aware of who the true master was. With the Battle of Alexander Nevsky, there are also a number of questions, because in the Neva no armor is found, very little armor, and so the extent of this battle today is questioned. And then there was a battle in the at the end of the 14th century, which also to the Russians is one of the major events in this whole relationship between Russia and the Tartars. Now, this battle belonged to the man by the name of Dmitry Danskoi. And the reason he's called Danskoi was because it took place on the River Don. It took place in September 1380 at the Kulikovo field near the Don River. Was won by Dmitry, and just as with Alexander, who is known by his sobriquet of Nevsky because of the river Neva, here this Dmitry is known by the sobriquet of Donskoy because of the river Don. And here is the Don River, right here. Here is the Sarai, and it's around here that the battle took place. Yes, Dmitry Danskoi won the battle, but the Russians continued to pay their dues to the Golden Horde for another 100 years. Even Ivan the Terrible's father in the early 16th century left an interesting document where he subdivides various dues that are owed to the Golden Horde by his sons. Actually, they're owed now at this point not even to the Golden Horde but to the Crimean Tartars, because the Golden Horde will begin to deteriorate in the 14th century, but actually it has nothing to do with the Russians. A man by the name of Timur, who in the West is known as Tamerlane, was born in the 14th century and near the Amudarya River. Right here, Amudarya and Sirdarya, right here. And he decided that he must fight the Golden Horde, and he assembled a large enough army to do so, and initiated a conflict with the Golden Horde, whereby, because he is here, he wished to redirect all the routes to the east instead of from the north to the south, and thus cut off the Golden Horde from the trade routes. In fact, to do to the Golden Horde what the Golden Horde did to the Russians. Cut off the trade routes, kill the industry, kill the cities. And that's what Timur or Tamerlane did, in fact, to the Golden Horde. But by that time, the Tartars in the Crimea Tartars, right there, became a powerful force, and they just continued to collect revenues from the Russian cities. So even though Kulikovo Pole is considered by the Russians as a great victory, in fact, for another 100 years, Russia continued to pay tribute, and there was absolutely no question of the fact that the Tartars were masters of the field. Interestingly, however, it is also in the 14th century that wonderful art begins to appear in Russia, and it's also in the 14th century that many a Tatar prince and his retinue, in fact, began to travel towards Moscow, towards these cities, escaping the Golden Horde that was being weakened. The court of Basil II, in fact, spoke Tatar. A number of Russian families changed their names to to the Tartar names, and names like Yusupov or Kutuzov, the great general, comes originally from these families that changed their names to Tartar names. The Tartars gave their appellations to all sorts of things, not just military equipment, but just anything and everything. And there is an expression in Russian, actually, scratch a Russian, find a Tatar. But art began to flourish in Russia, and it really, the first significant artist in Russia, significant icon artist, was still a Greek. His name is, in Russian, it's Theophanous the Greek, or it's Theophanous the Greek. He was born in Constantinople, and he became one of the greatest icon painters in Russia. He was educated in Constantinople. He studied art and philosophy at the University of Constantinople. He was a very cultivated and well-read man. And he then traveled first to Novgorod, and he lived in Novgorod for about 20 years, let's see. Moved to Novgorod in 1370, lived there for about 20-25 years, and then towards the end of the century, he moved to Moscow and lived in Moscow until his death. And he was the teacher of Andrey Rublyev, who is considered the greatest Russian icon painter. Here is Theophanus's Transfiguration. Transfiguration, Christ goes up on the mountain. He is accompanied by Peter, James, and John, and he leaves Peter, James, and John at the foot of the hill. Himself goes out on top of the mountain, and his three apostles see him transformed, transfigured, now in white garments, with Moses and Elijah on both sides of him. Moses and Elijah, two extremely important patriarchs of the Old Testament. So that's transfiguration and presages resurrection. And here we have Christ going up the mountain. He appears in white raiment, and then Moses and Elijah on the sides of him, and here are the apostles. It is still quite two-dimensional, but the colors here are lovely, and also Theophanus was known for his impetuous brushstroke. And considering that this is done in tempera, usually tempera is very concise and very contained, whereas here he exercises his brush strokes, which are rather emotional. The composition is very symmetrical. Christ in the middle, then the men are on each side of the icon. It is still done in the old style, where a piece of wood would then be carved in the center, sort of a frame left on the sides of that same wood, and then it's the inside that would be carved, and then on the outside some decoration could be done. It's very Byzantine, the technique. It possesses all the grace and expression of Byzantine art, because Russian icons were more static than the Byzantine icons, and larger. And so here is another very expressive painting of Theophanous the Greek, and here's his Saint Macarius, which is rather compelling. Obviously it's in very bad shape, but Saint Macarius was one of the Desert Fathers, lived in the 4th century, known for his asceticism and his wisdom. And there he is. This is the colors, and in this case a number of paintings that Theophan painted were monochromatic, which is not the case in this one. But something like this was monochromatic, and sometimes it's actually easier to see it in black and white. Highlights were very important, and as you see, There are highlights on his cheeks, on his hands, the eyebrows, the eyes themselves. In many cases, these icon painters would set up a workshop, and a number of masters would work in the workshop. There would be masters who would be preparing the wood panel itself, would be treated the wood panel with gesso, then others would be gluing some fabric to the gesso, still others would be responsible for, say, doing the hands, arms, and then of course the most important is the face. But it seems that with these icons of Theophanous the Greek, he certainly did the painting, all the painting himself. And as I mentioned, he was the tutor of Andrey Rublyev, who is considered the greatest icon painter of Russia. And one of his most famous paintings is the Trinity. Well, usually Trinity is depicted within its narrative scheme that Abraham and Sarah are now old and they still have no children. Sarah is barren, and both Sarah and Abraham are sad about it. But then three strangers appear before their tent. Needless to say, neither the husband nor the wife know who they are, but they're very hospitable. They give them food and they treat them as honored guests. And these three strangers then, on leaving, promise to Abraham and Sarah that they will indeed have a child, because those strangers were angels. And sure enough, Sarah will give birth to Isaac. Such is the Trinity theme. But Rublyev here decided to take it out of its narrative context altogether and place the three of them here. The 19th, 20th century, the consensus among scholars was that Rublyev, in fact, wished to represent the Trinity, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. This would be the personification of the whole idea of Trinity. They believe that the icon was created with this in mind, representing the Trinity, and the Holy Trinity at the time was regarded as the embodiment of spiritual unity, of peace, harmony, mutual love, humility. The angels themselves are seen as if talking. They're not eating, because usually they're shown as eating since Abraham fed them. But here they sit and contemplate and talk. Rublyev abandoned most of the traditional plot elements that I just told you about. And the angels are depicted as talking, not eating. The gestures of angels, smooth and restrained, demonstrate the sublime nature of their conversation. The silent communion of the three angels is the center of the composition. It's not in a great shape. It is in the Tretyakov gallery, but this is the consensus among art historians. After Andrey Rublyev, into the 15th century, the art of icon painting, as I said, will be spread throughout the land, and a number of workshops will be established that produced icons by hundreds, by thousands. Every household needed to have an icon, and every household had one. Here is an unusually emotional one, and it is also in the Tretyakov gallery. It's called The Entombment of Christ. And here I'm just giving you a similar subject, which was done by an Italian painter by the name of Giotto a century earlier. And this is the same theme. It's the theme of lamentation, essentially. And lamentation here, this lamentation comes from about 1300, and this comes from the 1400s. And in Italy, at this point, there's introduced the idea of emotion, of sorrow, of physical space, of three-dimensionality, of molding figures in space, Well, none of this exists in Russia more than 100 years later, and it is very much due to the cultural isolation that Russia faced from the very beginning. And at this point, the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches, whether Byzantine Church or Russian Church, are completely separate. There was a great schism in the year 1054, just when the Russian cities were just being formed. The great schism between the Byzantine Church and the Catholic Church. And the schism was never healed. In fact, it was only exacerbated. But here are the results. This is Russia still, of course, very much follows the Byzantine rules, but introduces some emotion, whereas Giotto is considered one of the first painters of the Italian Renaissance. This is an interesting icon. Somebody did know how to model faces, how to make them realistic looking. And here we have this icon of the four saints. The Paraskeva Pyatnitsa, she was a Byzantine girl who was baptized on a Friday. Friday is the day of crucifixion, and then became very devout Christian. So Paraskeva also means Friday in Greek. So Paraskeva Pyatnitsa in Russian means Friday, essentially. Paraskeva is Friday in Greek, and Pyatnitsa is Friday in Russian. Then there's Gregory, the theologian, also lived around the 4th, 5th centuries. John Chrysostom, his contemporary, and Basil the Great, who was the founder of the monasteries. She is the youngest. She lived, I think, in the 3rd century, whereas the three of them more or less contemporary. But while the icon painter, perhaps there were a couple, one painted the garments, and then another painted the faces, because this icon always reminded me of these boards that one sees in amusement parks, with the faces just cut out, and the board can depict a mermaid, it can depict anything and everything, and you just stick your face into it and take a selfie, or somebody takes a photograph of you. That's what this icon always reminded me of, because everything, all the garments are depicted entirely two-dimensionally. Flat, flat, and flat. But then the faces are very characteristic. The faces are actually realistic faces. So it almost appears that these three men kind of stuck their beards outside and hung them down, and then the woman as well. And they're even, well, obviously they're circles. The circles are their halos. But that's interesting about this particular icon, and it is early 15th century. This icon comes from. With time, there will be introduced another element to the icon. It's called riza in Russian, or oklad, which means covered, or it's revetment in English, and it could be in silver, it could be in gold. And it certainly meant to venerate the icon and the figure that's depicted on it. But then, because candles and oil lamps were always burnt in front of an icon would, of course, darken with time. And as a result, they were protected by these rizas, by these revetments. And they became, they originated in Byzantium, obviously, but then the Russians used them as well. With time, however, into the 17th century, 18th century, the icon itself, the art of the icon, in fact, deteriorated, whereas you see more and more of these revetments sort of to hide the inferior quality of the icon. But that was not the case originally. And a main feature of an interior of any Russian church is the so-called Iconostasis, the Iconostasis, which is the link between earth and heaven. The religious icons and paintings represented upon the Iconostasis, they serve sort of as a bridge, the connection between God and men. And so it is a dialogue between earth and heaven, and they're usually placed in front of the choir, just in front of the congregation. The congregation was not allowed to go beyond the iconostasis, as was often the case, in fact, in the Western churches. Thank you very much, and I will see you soon.